My name is Elaine, and I'm 62 years old, a secret millionaire widow. When my husband Howard passed away, he left me $75 million that nobody knew about, not even our only son Jackson. I decided to keep this fortune hidden, curious to see who would respect me for who I am, rather than for my wealth. When Jackson announced his engagement to Natalie, I wondered how they would treat a seemingly ordinary mother with simple tastes and modest means. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let me know if you're interested in how money can reveal people's true colors. Hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more real-life stories about wealth, family, and the unexpected lessons life teaches us. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where life was simple but comfortable. My parents worked hard, my father as a high school teacher and my mother as a nurse. We never had luxury, but we never went without necessities either. They taught me the value of hard work, education, and treating people with dignity regardless of their status or wealth. I met Howard during my sophomore year at Ohio State University. I was studying library science, and he was pursuing a degree in computer engineering. We literally bumped into each other at the campus library one rainy afternoon in October 1982. I was carrying a stack of books that scattered across the floor when we collided. "I'm so sorry," he said immediately, dropping to his knees to help gather my books. I was distracted thinking about this programming problem. Howard was tall and lanky, with thick glasses and an earnest smile. Not conventionally handsome, but there was something so genuine about him that caught my attention immediately. "It's okay," I replied. I wasn't looking where I was going either. After helping me with my books, he asked if he could buy me coffee as an apology. That coffee led to dinner the following weekend, which led to study dates, which eventually led to us falling deeply in love. Howard was brilliant, but shy, passionate about technology in a way that I found endearing, even though I barely understood what he was talking about half the time. He could talk for hours about circuit boards and coding languages, his eyes lighting up with excitement. I loved watching his mind work, the way he approached problems with such focus and creativity. We married right after graduation in a small ceremony with just family and a few close friends. Neither of us had any money to speak of, so we started our married life in a tiny one-bedroom apartment near the outskirts of Columbus. The place was barely 600 square feet with peeling wallpaper, unreliable heating, and neighbors who fought loudly at all hours, but it was ours, and we were happy. Howard found a job as a junior programmer at a local insurance company, while I worked at the public library. Our combined income was modest, but we managed our money carefully, saving what little we could. Date nights consisted of home-cooked meals and free community events. Vacations meant camping trips to state parks, rather than flights to exotic locations. 3 years into our marriage, I became pregnant with Jackson. We were overjoyed, but also terrified about the financial implications. How would we afford a bigger place, childcare, college savings? But somehow, we made it work the way young couples with limited means always do. Jackson was born on a snowy February morning in 1991. He was a beautiful baby with Howard's thoughtful eyes and my stubborn chin. Holding him for the first time, I felt a love so overwhelming it brought tears to my eyes. Howard was equally smitten, spending hours just watching our son sleep. "He's going to change the world someday, Elaine," Howard whispered one night as we stood over the crib. "I just know it." To accommodate our growing family, we moved to a slightly larger apartment with 2 bedrooms. I cut back my hours at the library to part-time so I could be home with Jackson more, which meant our budget got even tighter. There were months when we ate nothing but pasta and rice and beans, carefully counting pennies until the next paycheck arrived. Howard began staying up late after Jackson and I went to bed, working on what he called a side project. He'd converted a corner of our living room into a makeshift office with a desk he'd built from plywood and cinder blocks. Night after night, the blue glow of his computer screen illuminated the apartment as he typed away, fueled by cheap coffee and determination. "What exactly are you working on?" I asked him one night, bringing him a cup of tea. "It's a new kind of database management system," he explained, pulling me onto his lap despite my protests about his need to work. "The ones companies are using now are inefficient and prone to errors. I think I've found a better way." I didn't fully understand the technical aspects, but I understood his passion, his vision. Howard had always believed that technology could solve problems and make people's lives better. This wasn't just about creating a product. It was about creating something valuable, something needed. After a year of late nights and weekends sacrificed to his project, Howard officially incorporated his company, Datasphere Solutions, working out of our garage, which we'd converted into a small office. He convinced a former colleague to join him, and together they refined the software, prepared demonstrations, and began reaching out to potential clients. The early days of the business were incredibly stressful. Howard took out a second mortgage on our small house that we'd finally managed to buy, invested all our savings, and even borrowed money from my parents. There were times when I lay awake at night, terrified that we'd lose everything, that we'd end up back in that tiny apartment, or worse, but Howard never wavered in his belief. "This will work, Elaine," he promised. "I need you to trust me just a little longer." And I did trust him. I believed in Howard's vision and his ability to make it real. So I continued working at the library, took on additional freelance editing jobs, managed our household on a shoestring budget, and did my best to shield Jackson from our financial worries. Jackson was 7 when Datasphere landed its first major client, a regional healthcare system looking to overhaul its patient record management. The contract wasn't huge, but it was enough to hire 2 more employees and move the company out of our garage into a small office space downtown. From there, things began to change. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. More clients came, larger contracts were signed. Howard hired more people: programmers, salespeople, administrators. By the time Jackson was in middle school, Datasphere had grown to over 50 employees and was generating consistent profits. Despite this success, Howard and I made a conscious decision not to significantly change our lifestyle. We moved to a nicer home in a good school district, but nothing extravagant. We replaced our aging cars with newer, reliable models, but not luxury brands. We started a college fund for Jackson and took actual vacations that didn't involve tents, but we didn't splash money around. "I don't want Jackson to grow up thinking success means showing off," Howard explained, when I asked why he was so resistant to enjoying some of the fruits of his labor. "I want him to value work itself, to understand that what you build and how you treat people matters more than what you own." I agreed wholeheartedly. We'd both grown up in families where money was managed carefully, where extravagance was viewed with suspicion. Moreover, we'd been happy in our tiny apartment with our thrift store furniture and homemade entertainment. Money hadn't created that happiness. It had come from our love for each other, our shared goals, our simple pleasures. So we raised Jackson with the same values that had shaped us. He did chores to earn his allowance. He wore hand-me-downs from cousins and neighbors without complaint. When he was old enough to want more expensive things, the trendy sneakers or the latest gaming system, we made him save up for half the cost himself. But Tommy's parents just bought him the new PlayStation. He protested once around age 12. "We're not Tommy's parents," Howard replied calmly. "In this family, we save for things that matter to us. It teaches patience and appreciation." Jackson rolled his eyes, dramatically as preteens do, but he started doing extra chores and taking on small jobs for neighbors to save up his share. When he finally had enough and we took him to buy that PlayStation, the pride on his face was worth every complaint we'd endured. As Jackson moved through high school, Howard's company continued to thrive. There were acquisition offers from larger tech corporations, but Howard always declined. "This is my life's work," he told me. "I'm not ready to hand it over to someone else's vision." Jackson was a good student. Not exceptional like his father had been, but solid. He played baseball, had a close group of friends, and generally seemed like a well-adjusted teenager. When it came time for college applications, he set his sights on business schools. "I want to understand how successful companies work," he explained over dinner one night during his senior year. "Maybe I'll come work for Dad someday." Howard and I exchanged glances. We'd never pushed Jackson toward the family business, wanting him to find his own path. "You should study what interests you," Howard said carefully. "The company will be there if you ever want to explore that option, but there's no expectation." Jackson nodded, but I could tell he'd already made up his mind. He had his father's determination once a goal was set. He was accepted to several good business schools, and ultimately chose University of Michigan. Howard and I had saved enough to cover his tuition and basic expenses, but we were clear that luxuries would be his responsibility. He worked part-time throughout college, managing a decent balance between academics work and social life. During those college years, Howard's health began to show subtle signs of strain. Nothing dramatic, just increased fatigue, occasional shortness of breath, some weight gain around his middle, despite our reasonably healthy lifestyle. He brushed off my concerns, blaming age and desk work, promising to see a doctor, but always finding reasons to postpone. Jackson graduated with honors in 2013, and despite our assumptions, did not come to work for DataSphere. Instead, he accepted a position with a financial management firm in Chicago. "I want to make it on my own first," he explained. "I don't want anyone at Dad's company thinking I got special treatment." Howard and I were proud of his independence, even as we missed having him closer to home. We visited him in Chicago when we could, and he came home for holidays. Our relationship remained close, if naturally evolved from the intimacy of childhood to the more measured connections of adult family members. Looking back now, those years seem almost idyllic. Howard and I, settling into a comfortable middle age, enjoying the success of his company, without letting it fundamentally change us. Jackson, establishing himself professionally, making friends in Chicago, dating occasionally, but not seriously. None of us had any idea how dramatically everything was about to change. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday in April, 3 years ago. Howard and I had just finished dinner. We were sitting on the patio, enjoying the spring evening, planning a weekend visit to see Jackson in Chicago. "I think I'll turn in early," Howard said, standing up with a slight grimace. "Bit of indigestion from that pasta sauce." I watched him go inside, feeling a flicker of concern, but nothing urgent. 20 minutes later, I heard a thump from our bedroom. I found Howard on the floor, clutching his chest, his face gray with pain. The next few hours were a blur of ambulances, emergency rooms, and increasingly grim-faced doctors. By midnight, I was a widow. Howard had suffered a massive heart attack. His arteries severely blocked, despite no obvious risk factors beyond the stress of running his company. The next days passed in a haze of grief and administrative tasks. Jackson flew home immediately devastated by the suddenness of his father's death. Together, we planned a simple funeral, following Howard's often-stated preference for minimal fuss. No religious service, no lengthy eulogies, he'd said years before during a rare discussion about mortality. Just family and close friends, remembering the good times. We honored his wishes. The service was small, but meaningful, held at a local funeral home with about 50 attendees, family members, old friends, and key employees from Datasphere. Jackson spoke briefly about his father's integrity and vision. I couldn't bring myself to speak formally, but greeted each guest personally, sharing quiet memories. 3 days after the funeral, I received a call from Gerald Winters, Howard's personal attorney. I knew Gerald vaguely. He'd handled the contracts when Howard started Datasphere and had occasionally joined us for dinner over the years. But I had no idea why he'd be calling me directly. "Elaine, I need to meet with you privately regarding Howard's estate," he said, his voice formal, in a way that suggested importance. Would tomorrow afternoon be possible? I agreed, assuming this was standard legal procedure, perhaps related to the company Howard had built. Jackson offered to accompany me, but Gerald specified the meeting was for me alone, at least initially. The next day, I drove to Gerald's downtown office, still moving through the world, with the peculiar detachment of the recently bereaved. His assistant showed me into a conference room, where Gerald waited with a folder of documents and a sympathetic expression. "Elaine, before we begin, I want to express my personal condolences," he said, gesturing for me to sit. Howard was not just my client, but my friend. "Thank you," I replied automatically, having heard variations of this sentiment dozens of times in recent days. Gerald cleared his throat. "I've asked you here because there are aspects of Howard's estate that you're not aware of. Aspects he specifically kept private until they needed to be addressed." I frowned, not understanding. "What aspects?" "We've always been transparent about our finances." Gerald slid a document across the table. "Howard sold Datasphere 18 months ago to Nexus Technologies. The sale was conducted with absolute confidentiality, with only myself, Howard, and the Nexus executives aware of the transaction." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "That's not possible. Howard went to work at Datasphere every day. He talked about projects, employees, client meetings." "Yes," Gerald nodded. "That was part of the agreement. Howard remained as CEO with day-to-day operational control for a transition period of 3 years. To all appearances, nothing changed. This arrangement preserved company stability and prevented competitors from attempting to poach clients or employees." My mind struggled to process this information. "But why wouldn't he tell me?" Gerald slid another document across the table. "The sale price. Elaine." I looked down at the paper, and the number seemed to swim before my eyes. $75,000. $75 million, I whispered, feeling suddenly lightheaded. "Yes, after taxes and transaction costs, approximately $68 million. Howard invested it conservatively. Treasury bonds, blue-chip dividend stocks, some real estate investment trusts. The portfolio now stands at approximately $75 million. I couldn't speak. Howard and I had lived comfortably, but modestly. We'd never discussed having this kind of wealth. wealth that would fundamentally change how one moves through the world, how others perceive you, the opportunities and responsibilities that come with it. Why? I finally managed. Why wouldn't he tell me about this? Gerald handed me an envelope. He asked me to give you this if anything happened to him before the transition period ended. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded a letter written in Howard's familiar, precise handwriting. My dearest Elaine, if you're reading this, I didn't get to share this news with you myself, and for that, I'm deeply sorry. The decision to sell Datasphere wasn't made lightly, nor was my choice to keep it from you temporarily. The company had reached a crossroads. To grow further would have required resources and connections I couldn't provide. Nexus offered not just financial compensation, but the infrastructure to take our technology global to help more people. It was the right decision for the company's future. As for keeping it from you, this will sound strange, but I wanted to protect us from sudden wealth, at least for a while. I have seen how money changes people, not always for the better. I wanted time to plan how we would handle this blessing without letting it fundamentally change who we are and what we value. I trust your wisdom, Elaine. You've always been the moral compass of our family. Use this money in whatever way feels right to you. Support causes we believe in. Ensure Jackson's future while still encouraging his independence. Most importantly, take care of yourself. Travel, learn, explore, all those things we said we'd do someday. I've loved our simple life together, every minute of it. The wealth we've accumulated doesn't begin to compare with the richness of our years together. All my love, always. Howard. Tears streamed down my face as I read his words. Even in death, Howard was thinking of protecting our family from the potential negative effects of sudden wealth. It was so characteristic of him. Thoughtful, forward-thinking, concerned with values over appearances. There are decisions to be made, Gerald said gently, after giving me time to compose myself. About the portfolio management, about informing Jackson, about your own financial planning. I took a deep breath. I need time to think. This is overwhelming. Of course, Gerald nodded. The current management arrangements will continue functioning without immediate input. Take whatever time you need. I left Gerald's office in a daze, the reality of my situation still not fully registering. I was a multimillionaire, wealthy beyond anything I'd ever imagined for myself. Yet, I was also a grieving widow, suddenly solely responsible for a fortune I hadn't known existed until an hour ago. Over the next few weeks, as the initial shock subsided, I made several key decisions. First, I would maintain our current lifestyle, at least for now. I saw no reason to suddenly change how I lived, to buy extravagant things, or move to a mansion. Second, I would not immediately tell Jackson about the money. This was perhaps the most difficult decision, but I kept returning to Howard's letter. His concern about how sudden wealth might impact our values. Jackson was just establishing himself professionally, finding his own way. Would knowing about this inheritance change his motivation, his sense of self? Third, I would educate myself about wealth management. I spent hours researching, reading books, taking online courses. I hired a different financial advisor than the one managing the existing portfolio, not telling him the full extent of my assets, but seeking his educational guidance on understanding investment concepts. Finally, I established an anonymous charitable foundation, working with a specialized attorney to create a structure that would allow me to support causes important to Howard and me without revealing my identity as the donor. For the next several months, I lived two parallel lives. To the outside world, to Jackson, to friends and neighbors, I was simply Elaine Howard's widow, living on what they presumed was a modest inheritance and perhaps life insurance. Only Gerald, my new financial advisor, and the foundation attorney knew the truth. It wasn't always easy maintaining this deception. There were moments when I wanted to use this money to help people I cared about, to pay off a neighbor's medical bills, to fund a friend's struggling business, to surprise Jackson by eliminating his student loans. But each time I reminded myself of Howard's caution and held back. Instead, I channeled those impulses into anonymous giving through the foundation focusing on educational opportunities for low-income students, small business development in struggling communities, and medical research related to heart disease. As I adjusted to this strange new reality, I found myself wondering, how would people treat me if they knew I was wealthy? Would friends behave differently? Would strangers be more accommodating? Would potential romantic partners, though I wasn't ready to consider that, be interested in me or my money? Most of all, I wondered about Jackson. Would knowing about this inheritance change my son, the person Howard and I had raised to value work, simplicity, and personal achievement? Little did I know that circumstances would soon provide answers to these questions, particularly regarding my son. Jackson had been working at Bradley Financial Partners in Chicago for nearly 4 years when he called with exciting news. "Mom, I'm seeing someone special," he said, sounding happier than I'd heard him since Howard's death. "Her name is Natalie Palmer. She works in PR for one of our client companies." "That's wonderful, honey," I replied, genuinely pleased. Jackson had dated casually since college, but had never sounded this enthused about anyone before. "Tell me about her." "She's amazing, Mom. Smart, beautiful, ambitious. She graduated from Northwestern Works for Stone Communications, handling their luxury brand clients. She loves art, knows all the best restaurants in the city, has traveled everywhere." Something in his description gave me a momentary pause. He was focusing entirely on Natalie's accomplishments and sophistication, nothing about her character or how she treated him. But I dismissed my concern as premature. This was just an excited first description, after all. "I'd love to meet her," I said. "Maybe when I visit next month." "Actually, we're thinking of coming to see you in 2 weeks. Is that too soon?" I was surprised, but delighted. "Not at all. I'll make up the guest room." The next 2 weeks, I found myself unexpectedly nervous about meeting Natalie. I cleaned the house, thoroughly planned meals I hoped would impress, even bought a new outfit, a simple but elegant sweater and slacks that cost more than I would typically spend, but still aligned with my deliberately modest lifestyle. They arrived on a Friday evening, Jackson carrying their bags, while a striking young woman walked beside him, taking in the neighborhood with evaluative eyes. Natalie Palmer was indeed beautiful, tall and slim, with glossy dark hair, cut in an expensive-looking bob, wearing designer jeans and a cashmere wrap that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. "Mom, this is Natalie," Jackson said, his face glowing with pride. "Natalie, my mother, Elaine. It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Wilson," Natalie said, offering a manicured hand and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Jackson talks about you constantly." "Please call me Elaine," I replied warmly. "I'm so happy to finally meet you. Come in, you must be tired from the drive." As I led them inside, I noticed Natalie glancing around, taking in the modest furnishings, the slightly worn carpet, the family photos on walls, needing a fresh coat of paint. Nothing was said, but I felt an assessment being made. Over dinner, a homemade lasagna that had always been one of Jackson's favorites. Natalie spoke mainly about her work with luxury brands, the celebrities she'd met, the exclusive events she'd attended. She was articulate and poised, but I noticed she rarely asked questions about me or showed interest in anything beyond her own experiences. "This house must hold so many memories," she commented during a momentary lull in conversation. "How long have you lived here?" "About 25 years, I replied. "Howard and I bought it when Jackson was 7. "It has such character," she said, in a tone that managed to make the words sound like a polite substitute for outdated or run down. Jackson jumped in quickly. "Mom's never been one for keeping up with design trends. She cares more about comfort than style." "Right, Mom." There was something apologetic in his tone that bothered me, as if my practical, comfortable home was something to be embarrassed about, rather than the loving family space it had always been. The weekend continued in this vein. Natalie was never openly rude, but there was a constant undercurrent of condescension in her comments about my clothes, so practical, my kitchen appliances, charmingly retro, even my garden, quaint. On Saturday afternoon, while Jackson was on a video call for work, Natalie joined me in the kitchen as I prepared dinner. "Jackson mentioned you used to be a librarian," she said, watching me chop vegetables. "Yes, for almost 30 years. I retired after Howard passed." "That must have been," she seemed to search for an appropriate word, "fulfilling. Though I imagine the salary was challenging. Library science isn't exactly a lucrative field." "We managed just fine," I replied evenly. "Howard and I believed in living within our means." "Of course." She nodded her expression, suggesting she found this philosophy quaint but limited. "Still, wouldn't it be nice to upgrade a bit now? A new kitchen, perhaps, or some travel?" "I travel some," I said, thinking of the trip to Italy I'd taken through my foundation work, ostensibly as a volunteer, rather than a major donor. "But I'm comfortable with my life as it is." Natalie looked genuinely perplexed, as if the concept of being content with modest means was incomprehensible to her. When Jackson returned, the conversation shifted to their life in Chicago. Their friends, who all seemed to work in finance law or luxury industries, and the exclusive residential building where they were considering buying a condo. "The views are incredible, Mom," Jackson enthused. "You can see the entire lakefront and the amenities. There's a concierge, a roof deck, a private gym." "It sounds lovely," I said, "but also very expensive." A slight flush crept up Jackson's neck. "Well, I've been doing well at the firm, and Natalie's family might help with the down payment." This was the first mention of Natalie's family, and I realized I knew nothing about them. "Tell me about your parents, Natalie. What do they do?" "Daddy runs Palmer Luxury Imports. They're the exclusive North American distributor for several European car manufacturers," she replied with evident pride. "Mother manages their charitable foundation and sits on several boards. They have houses in Lake Forest, Palm Beach, and Aspen." "They sound very accomplished," I said diplomatically, noting the emphasis on possessions and status rather than character or values. That evening, as I was clearing dishes after dinner, I overheard Natalie speaking quietly to Jackson in the living room. "Honey, don't take this the wrong way, but has your mom considered selling this house? It's way too big for one person, and the equity could help her upgrade to something more current, maybe a nice condo with security and amenities." "I don't think she's ready," Jackson replied. "This place was her life with Dad." "But it's been 3 years," Natalie persisted. She should be moving forward. Besides, the neighborhood is clearly declining. I stood frozen in the kitchen, dishes in hand, stunned by her presumption. Our neighborhood was stable, safe, filled with families and retirees who'd lived there for decades, hardly declining by any measure, except perhaps by comparison to the exclusive areas Natalie preferred. More troubling was Jackson's response. Not defending our family home or neighborhood, just suggesting I wasn't ready to move on, as if Natalie's assessment was fundamentally correct. The rest of the weekend confirmed my growing concerns about Natalie's values, and more worryingly, her influence on Jackson. By Sunday afternoon, when they departed for Chicago, I had a knot of unease in my stomach that no amount of rationalizing could dispel. Over the next few months, Jackson's calls became less frequent, and when we did speak, he mainly talked about work, new restaurants he and Natalie had tried, or expensive weekend trips they'd taken. He asked fewer questions about my life, sometimes seeming distracted or rushed. Then came the call I'd been half expecting. "Mom, I have amazing news," Jackson said, excitement evident in his voice. "Natalie and I are engaged." "Congratulations," I replied, trying to match his enthusiasm while tamping down my reservations. "When did this happen?" "Last night. I took her to Alinea, that 3-Michelin-star restaurant I mentioned, and proposed after the dessert course. You should have seen her face when she saw the ring." "I'm happy for you both," I said, meaning it despite my concerns. If Natalie made Jackson happy, I needed to try harder to see her positive qualities. "Have you thought about when the wedding might be?" "Actually, we're thinking about a quick timeline. Her parents want to host something at their Lake Forest estate this summer. Is that too soon?" 5 months to plan a wedding seemed rushed, but I kept that thought to myself. "If that's what you both want, I think it sounds lovely." "Great, Natalie will be so pleased. She's already talking to wedding planners." "Oh, and Mom, her parents want to meet you. They're hosting a dinner next weekend in Chicago. Could you make it?" "Of course." I agreed, curious to meet the people who had raised Natalie, and curious about whether they shared her apparent preoccupation with wealth and status. The following weekend, I drove to Chicago in my 8-year-old Toyota, feeling increasingly self-conscious as I approached the exclusive address where the Palmers were hosting dinner. The valet who took my keys couldn't quite hide his surprise at the modest vehicle amid the luxury cars lining the circular drive. The Palmers' Chicago apartment occupied the entire top floor of a Gold Coast high-rise with breathtaking views of Lake Michigan. The interior was showcased in a style that whispered, "expensive," rather than shouted it. Museum-quality art on the walls, furniture that looked both antique and pristine floors of polished marble. Howard and Linda Palmer were an imposing couple in their early 60s. Howard was tall and fit, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Linda was elegant in that particularly wealthy way that suggests countless hours devoted to maintaining her appearance. Not a hair out of place, jewelry that was valuable, but understated a designer dress that looked effortless, but certainly wasn't. "You must be Elaine," Linda said, air-kissing near my cheek. "How wonderful to finally meet Jackson's mother. Natalie has told us so much about you." Given what Natalie had observed of my life, I wondered exactly what she'd told them, but I smiled and thanked them for their hospitality. "Jackson is a fine young man," Howard said, handing me a glass of champagne that probably cost more than I typically spent on groceries in a week. "You and your late husband clearly did an excellent job raising him." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely appreciating the acknowledgement of Howard's role in Jackson's upbringing. "We're very proud of him." Dinner was served by uniformed staff at a table that could have comfortably seated 16, though only the 6 of us, the Palmers, Natalie Jackson, and myself, were present. The conversation centered mainly on the wedding plans, which were rapidly taking shape. "We're thinking 200 guests," Linda explained. "Just close friends and family." The number startled me. Howard and I had maybe 50 people at our wedding, and I'd considered that a substantial gathering. "That sounds quite large," I ventured. "Oh, it's actually quite intimate by our standards," Linda replied with a light laugh. "Howard's business associates alone could fill that number, but we're trying to keep it relatively small." As dinner progressed, I became increasingly aware of a dynamic I hadn't anticipated. The Palmers, while superficially welcoming, were subtly positioning themselves as the dominant family in this union. They spoke about hosting engagement parties, introducing Jackson to the right people who could advance his career, and even hinted at helping the couple with a down payment on a luxury condo. "Real estate is all about location," Howard pronounced, "and in Chicago, there are really only a few neighborhoods worth considering for someone on Jackson's career trajectory." Jackson, to my dismay, seemed to bask in their approval, eagerly agreeing with their suggestions and assessments. It was as if he were auditioning for membership in their world and his own background. Our family's values of modesty, hard work, and substance over style was something to be minimized rather than honored. At one point, Linda turned to me directly. "Elaine, will you be staying in that big house now that Jackson is starting his own family? It must be so much to maintain on your own." The question echoed Natalie's earlier suggestion that I should sell my home, and I wondered if they'd discussed this. "I'm quite comfortable there," I replied. "The house is paid for, and I've never found it difficult to maintain." "But surely, at your age, you should be thinking about something more manageable," Linda persisted. "A nice retirement community, perhaps with people your own age and activities organized for you." I was 62, hardly ready for a retirement community, but I smiled politely. "I'll certainly consider all options when the time comes." The evening continued in this vein. Subtle suggestions about how I should change my life, thinly veiled assessments of my perceived financial limitations, and an increasing sense that I was being evaluated and found lacking as a suitable mother-in-law for their daughter. On the drive back to my hotel, Jackson was effusive about the evening. "Aren't they great, Mom? So welcoming and generous." I chose my words carefully. "They clearly care about Natalie's happiness, and they seem to have accepted you warmly." "But what did you think of them?" he pressed. "They're very different from our family," I said diplomatically. "Their values and priorities seem quite focused on external measures of success." Jackson's expression cooled. "Mom, not everyone thinks success is something to be ashamed of. The Palmers have worked hard for what they have." "I never suggested they hadn't," I replied, startled by his defensive tone. "And neither your father nor I ever taught you that success is shameful. We simply believed that characters matters more than possessions." "Dad would have adapted better to this," Jackson muttered. "He understood business networking, making connections. He wouldn't be judging them for enjoying the rewards of their success." The comment stung deeply. Howard had indeed understood business, but he had also deliberately chosen a modest lifestyle for our family, despite his company's success. He would have been concerned, as I was, about the materialistic values the Palmers seemed to embody. But I didn't say this to Jackson. Instead, I simply reached over and squeezed his hand. "I'm not judging anyone, honey. I just want you to be happy." Later that night, alone in my hotel room, I found myself wondering what Howard would advise in this situation? Would he want me to tell Jackson about the inheritance now before the wedding? Would that help Jackson stand more confidently in his own values rather than being dazzled by the Palmers' wealth? Or would it simply compound the problem, making money an even more central focus? I still had no answers when I fell into a troubled sleep. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Jackson's upcoming marriage wasn't just a union between two people. It was a collision of fundamentally different value systems, and I wasn't sure our family's values were winning. The months leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of activity, most of it orchestrated by Natalie and her mother, with minimal input from Jackson or myself. The Palmers had engaged a high-end wedding planner who specialized in what she called luxury nuptial experiences, and the event was rapidly escalating in both scale and extravagance. The venue had been secured, the Palmers Lake Forest Estate, with its manicured gardens and lake views. A renowned Chicago chef was designing a multi-course menu featuring seasonal delicacies. A string quartet from the Chicago Symphony would perform during the ceremony, followed by a 12-piece band for the reception. We've reserved a block of rooms at the Peninsula for out-of-town guests, Linda informed me during one of our increasingly frequent phone calls. Of course, you're welcome to stay there too, Elaine, as mother of the groom. Our treat. The offer was generous, but felt somehow condescending, as if they assumed I couldn't afford such accommodation, which, based on what they knew about me, was a reasonable assumption. But it still rankled. That's very kind, I replied. But I think I'll stay with my friend Susan, who lives in Evanston. We rarely get to visit in person. This was a small rebellion on my part. Susan was indeed a dear friend from college days, but staying with her, rather than at the luxury hotel, was also a way of maintaining some independence from the Palmers' orchestration of every detail. As the wedding planning progressed, I found myself increasingly sidelined. Traditional etiquette suggested that as mother of the groom, I should host the rehearsal dinner, but Linda had already arranged for this to take place at an exclusive country club where the Palmers were members. We thought it would be simplest this way, she explained when I broached the subject. And of course, we're happy to handle the expense. We know teachers' pensions only stretch so far. I didn't correct her assumption that I had been a teacher rather than a librarian. The distinction hardly mattered in the context of her clear implication that I couldn't afford to host an appropriate event. More concerning was Jackson's changing attitude toward me. He had always been a considerate, attentive son, but now he seemed to view me through the Palmers' lens, as someone slightly embarrassing, needing to be managed and modernized. Mom, I've scheduled you an appointment at Nordstrom with a personal stylist, he told me during one of my visits to Chicago, for the wedding and rehearsal dinner outfits. That's thoughtful, but unnecessary, I replied. I already have a lovely dress for the wedding. Jackson looked uncomfortable. Is it the blue one you wore to Cousin Rachel's wedding? Because that's a bit dated, Mom. Natalie's family is very fashion conscious, and I thought you might want something more current. I see, I said quietly, hurt by the implication that my appearance might embarrass him. And who's paying for this styling session and new outfits? I am, he said quickly. It's a gift. But later that evening, I overheard him on the phone with Natalie. Yes, she agreed to the stylist. No, I didn't tell her your mom arranged it. I know, but she's sensitive about these things. Well, we can't have her showing up in something from the 1990s, can we? The conversation confirmed my worst fears about how I was perceived by my future daughter-in-law, and increasingly by my own son. Not as a person of value in my own right, but as a potential embarrassment to be managed, a problem to be solved. Despite my hurt, I kept these feelings to myself and attended the styling appointment. The stylist was actually kind and helpful, finding me elegant options that respected my preference for simplicity while updating my look subtly. I selected a dove gray dress and jacket for the wedding that was both appropriate and flattering. What Jackson didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I could have bought out the entire designer floor if I'd wanted to. The irony of being treated as financially limited while secretly having access to millions wasn't lost on me. As the wedding date approached, I was invited to Chicago for a bridal luncheon, hosted by Linda for the female members of the wedding party and immediate family. The event was held in a private dining room at an exclusive women's club, with elaborate floral arrangements and personalized gift bags for each guest. Natalie's bridesmaids were all cut from the same cloth. Attractive young women from wealthy families working in fashion, public relations, or art galleries. They clustered together, sharing inside jokes and stories about exclusive parties and luxury vacations. I was seated between Linda and an elderly woman introduced as Natalie's grandmother, who seemed as out of place as I felt, though for different reasons. Her hearing was poor, and she struggled to follow the rapid, slang-filled conversations around us. "Jackson seems like a nice young man," she commented to me between courses. "What did you say his father did?" "He was in technology," I replied simply. "He founded a database software company." "Oh, which one?" she asked with mild interest. "Datasphere Solutions. It was acquired a few years before he passed away." "I don't think I've heard of it," she said dismissively, clearly expecting I would have named a major corporation like Microsoft or Oracle. Before I could respond, Linda leaned in. "Elaine, I've been meaning to ask for the mother of the groom introduction at the reception. What would you like us to say about you, your career interests, that sort of thing?" The question caught me off guard. What would they say about me? Former librarian, widow, current. What secret millionaire philanthropist wasn't an option I could disclose. Just that I'm Jackson's mother, and I'm delighted to welcome Natalie to our family, I replied. Linda looked disappointed by my lack of notable accomplishments to announce. "Well, yes, of course that. But surely there's something more personal, community involvement. Perhaps hobbies." I thought about the foundation I'd established, the millions we'd distributed to support education for underprivileged students, the medical research we'd funded, the small businesses we'd helped launch in struggling communities. None of it could be mentioned. "I enjoy gardening and reading," I said instead. "And I volunteer at a literacy program in my community." Linda nodded with what seemed like sympathy for my apparently limited life. "That's nice. We'll work something appropriate into the introduction." Later in the luncheon, as dessert was being served, the conversation turned to the couple's future living arrangements. Natalie announced that they were close to finalizing the purchase of a luxury condo in one of Chicago's most prestigious buildings. "Daddy's helping with the down payment as our wedding gift," she explained. "It's the penthouse unit with lake views and 3 bedrooms. Plenty of room for when we start a family." "How wonderful," one of the bridesmaids gushed. "And so practical of Uncle Howard to help. Real estate is the best investment." "Speaking of practical," Natalie said, turning to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Jackson mentioned you might be considering downsizing, Elaine. That big old house must be such a burden for you alone." The comment, made in front of all these strangers, felt like a deliberate attempt to emphasize my perceived financial limitations and dependent status. "My home suits me perfectly," I replied evenly. but thank you for your concern. Well, if you ever change your mind, Linda interjected, Howard knows an excellent real estate agent who specializes in helping seniors transition to more appropriate accommodations. Seniors. The word hung in the air like an indictment. At 62, I was hardly elderly, but in their eyes, I was clearly past relevance, a burden to be managed rather than a person to be respected. On the drive back to my hotel, I found myself questioning my decision to keep Howard's wealth a secret. Would knowing about the inheritance change how the Palmers treated me? Almost certainly. Would that be a good thing? I wasn't so sure. Being valued for your money seemed little better than being devalued for your lack of it. But what about Jackson? My son was increasingly aligning himself with the Palmers' value system, seemingly embarrassed by the modest upbringing that Howard and I had provided. Would knowing about his inheritance change his perspective, remind him of the values his father had lived by? Or would it simply reinforce the growing materialism I was witnessing in him? I had no clear answers, but a growing sense that things were coming to a head. The wedding was just 2 weeks away, and the collision between the Palmers' world of conspicuous consumption and my own, more modest values was becoming unavoidable. What Howard would want, what he would advise in this situation, I couldn't be certain. But I was increasingly sure of one thing: the time for passively observing was coming to an end. One way or another, I would need to make a stand for the values Howard and I had built our lives around. Not just for my own dignity, but for Jackson's future happiness as well. The engagement party, held at the Palmers' Lake Forest estate the weekend before the wedding, was undeniably spectacular. The sprawling mansion was illuminated with thousands of fairy lights, transforming the gardens into an enchanted landscape. A jazz quartet played on the terrace overlooking the lake. Waitstaff circulated with trays of champagne, an hors d'oeuvre created by a chef flown in from New York specifically for the occasion. I arrived wearing the new outfit purchased during my stylist appointment, a simple but elegant pantsuit in navy blue that the stylist had assured me was both timeless and current. As I entered the grand foyer, a uniformed attendant took my lightweight jacket and directed me toward the terrace, where guests were gathering. Linda Palmer spotted me immediately, sweeping over in a designer gown that probably cost more than my car. "Elaine, you made it, and don't you look nice? The stylist did a good job finding something appropriate for you." The compliment, if it could be called that, had the familiar sting of condescension I'd grown accustomed to from Linda. I smiled politely. "Thank you for hosting this lovely event. The setting is beautiful. We wanted to give the children a proper send-off," she replied. "After all, a marriage isn't just between two people. It's a joining of families." Though I nodded in agreement, I wondered if Linda truly believed that. From everything I'd observed, the Palmers viewed this marriage as an acquisition rather than a partnership. They were absorbing Jackson into their world, their values, their way of doing things, with little regard for the family history and traditions he brought with him. Jackson appeared at my side, looking handsome in a tailored suit I hadn't seen before. "Mom, you made it," he said, kissing my cheek. "What do you think of all this?" "It's very impressive," I said truthfully. "The Palmers have certainly gone all out." "Wait till you see the wedding," he grinned. "This is just the warm-up." I studied my son's face, trying to see past the surface excitement to what lay beneath. Was he truly happy, or just dazzled by the opulence surrounding him? The Jackson I'd raised had never cared much about material displays, had often rolled his eyes at conspicuous consumption. Now, he seemed not just comfortable in this environment, but eager to be part of it. "As long as you're happy, that's all that matters to me," I said softly. A slight shadow crossed his face. "I am happy, Mom. I wish you could be happier for me. Sometimes I feel like you don't approve of Natalie or her family." "That's not true," I protested, though perhaps not as convincingly as I should have. "I just want to make sure you're making choices that align with your own values, not someone else's." "My values have evolved," Jackson replied, a slight edge to his voice. "That happens when you expand your horizons beyond a small suburban existence." The comment hurt more than he could know. Howard and I had chosen our small suburban existence, deliberately valuing community and stability over status and display. To hear Jackson dismiss it so casually felt like a rejection, not just of our lifestyle, but of the values that had shaped his upbringing. Before I could respond, Natalie appeared stunning in a white designer dress that highlighted her slender figure. "There you are, babe," she said to Jackson, then nodded to me. "Hello, Elaine. I'm glad you could make it." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied with a smile that felt increasingly forced. "Have you seen the gifts table?" Natalie continued. "People have been so incredibly generous. The silver from Howard's business partners is absolutely museum quality." "How lovely," I managed. "You should circulate Mom," Jackson suggested. "The Carltons were asking about you earlier. They're by the fountain." It was a polite dismissal, and I took it as such, moving away to allow the engaged couple to greet other guests. Throughout the evening, I found myself on the periphery of conversations, included but not integrated, acknowledged but not embraced. The Carltons, when I found them, were pleasant enough. Friends of the Palmers who asked generic questions about my life and then quickly turned the conversation back to themselves, their recent trip to the Amalfi Coast, their children at prestigious universities. As the evening progressed, dinner was served at elegantly appointed tables scattered throughout the garden. I found myself seated with distant relatives of the Palmers and a couple I hadn't previously met. "And how do you know the happy couple?" the woman asked politely. "I'm Jackson's mother," I replied. "Oh," she looked momentarily surprised. "How nice. Howard and Linda have mentioned Jackson is in finance." "Yes, he works for Bradley Financial Partners." "A good firm." Her husband nodded. "Not quite Goldman Sachs, but respectable." "And what does your husband do?" "My husband passed away 3 years ago," I explained. "He was in technology." "I'm sorry for your loss," the woman said automatically. "Technology, you say? With which company?" "He founded Datasphere Solutions," I replied, using the full name rather than the abbreviated Datasphere most people used. The husband's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Datasphere, the database company that Nexus Technologies acquired." I was startled that he knew of the acquisition, which had been kept fairly quiet in the industry. "Yes, that's right." He gave me a more appraising look. "That was a substantial transaction, as I recall. Your husband must have done quite well from that sale." For a moment, I considered acknowledging the truth just to see the reaction. Instead, I said simply, "Howard was always more interested in creating something valuable than in accumulating wealth." The conversation moved on, but I noticed a subtle shift in their attention to me, a slightly increased interest that hadn't been there before the mention of Datasphere. It was a small reminder of how quickly perceptions could change based on perceived financial status. After dinner, Howard Palmer called for everyone's attention, raising a glass in a toast to the engaged couple. He spoke eloquently about Natalie's many accomplishments, her intelligence and drive, her bright future. When he turned to Jackson, his praise was generous but revealing. When Natalie first introduced us to Jackson, Howard said, "I was impressed by his ambition, his understanding of the business world, and his clear desire to build a successful life. In the months since he's become like a son to Linda and me, we're proud to welcome him into our family and to help guide his career toward even greater heights." The words, "help guide his career," caught my attention. There was a proprietary quality to Howard's toast, as if Jackson were being acquired along with Natalie's hand in marriage. Jackson's responding toast was equally revealing. He thanked the Palmers effusively for their generosity and welcome, describing them as role models for the kind of success he aspired to achieve. He mentioned me briefly, thanking me for always supporting his dreams, but there was no similar acknowledgement of Howard, of the values his father had instilled in him, of the family legacy he carried. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing alone near the edge of the terrace, looking out over the moonlit lake. The beauty of the setting contrasted sharply with my growing unease about the path Jackson was choosing. "Not quite your scene, is it?" I turned to find Howard Palmer beside me, swirling amber liquid in a crystal tumbler. "It's a beautiful party," I replied diplomatically. "But not your style," he persisted. "Linda mentioned you live quite simply." "By choice," I said, meeting his gaze directly. Howard and I always believed that experiences and relationships matter more than possessions. Howard nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "An admirable philosophy in theory, but in practice, money opens doors, creates opportunities, builds legacies. I've been able to give Natalie advantages that shape who she is today." "Jackson had advantages too," I replied. "Parents who were present and involved, a home filled with books and conversation, values that emphasized character over acquisition." Howard studied me for a moment. "You don't approve of us, do you? Of our lifestyle, our values, perhaps even of Natalie?" The directness of the question took me by surprise, but I matched his candor. "I think we measure success differently, Mr. Palmer, and I worry about the influence your family's values are having on my son." "Your son is a grown man," Howard replied, a slight edge to his voice. "Perhaps he's simply recognizing that there's more to life than the limited horizons you and your husband provided." The comment stung, echoing Jackson's earlier dismissal of our small suburban existence. "There's nothing limited about integrity, compassion, or genuine human connection," I said quietly. Those were the horizons Howard and I tried to expand for Jackson. Howard Palmer gave me a look that combined pity with condescension. "Noble sentiments, Mrs. Wilson, but this is the real world where status and connections matter. Linda and I can offer Jackson entree into circles that will advance his career significantly. All we ask is that he embrace our values and traditions, and that includes presenting a certain image." "And where do I fit into this image?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Howard had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "You're Jackson's mother, and you'll always have a place in his life, but perhaps a more peripheral one than you've been accustomed to. Natalie will be his primary family now, and by extension, so will we." As I opened my mouth to respond, I heard voices approaching, Natalie and Jackson, along with Linda and several guests. "There you are, Daddy," Natalie called. "The Harringtons are leaving and want to say goodbye." Howard nodded to me, a conversation concluded, and moved away to join his daughter. Jackson glanced between us curiously, but didn't ask what we'd been discussing. As I drove back to my hotel that night, Howard Palmer's words echoed in my mind. A more peripheral place. The phrase encapsulated what I'd been feeling throughout the engagement. A deliberate marginalization, a pushing aside to make room for the Palmers' influence. But what troubled me most wasn't the Palmers' attitude toward me. It was Jackson's apparent acceptance of it. His willingness to minimize his own family history and values in pursuit of acceptance into their world of wealth and status. Howard, my Howard, had wanted to protect us from the potential negative effects of sudden wealth. But in doing so, had he inadvertently left Jackson vulnerable to being dazzled by the very materialism he'd hoped to shield him from. These thoughts churned in my mind as I prepared for bed. I was about to turn out the light when my phone rang. Jackson calling unusually late. "Mom, are you still up?" he asked when I answered. "Yes, just getting ready for bed." "Is everything all right?" Fine, he assured me, though he sounded tense. "I just wanted to check that you got back to the hotel, okay? And to ask, what were you and Howard talking about on the terrace?" So he had been curious after all. "Just getting to know each other better," I said carefully. "Family backgrounds, values, that sort of thing." He didn't say anything. "Awkward, did he?" Jackson pressed. "Define awkward," I replied. There was a pause. "Mom, I know the Palmers can seem a bit intense about status and appearances. They don't mean any harm by it. It's just their world, their way of doing things." "And is it your world now, too?" I asked gently. Another pause, longer this time. "I love Natalie, Mom. Being with her means adapting to certain expectations, certain social norms, even if those norms include pushing your mother to the periphery because she doesn't fit the image." The words came out before I could reconsider them. "What? No one's pushing you anywhere," Jackson protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Jackson, I overheard you and Natalie talking about my clothes, about how I might embarrass you at the wedding. I've heard the suggestions that I sell my home, update my life, essentially erase the history your father and I built." "That's not fair," Jackson said, his voice tight. "Everyone just wants what's best for you." "Best for me, or more convenient for all of you?" I challenged. "Because from where I stand, it looks like I'm being managed rather than respected." "Mom, you're overreacting. We're just trying to help you adjust to modern standards, to a higher quality of life. Quality of life isn't measured by the price tag on my clothes or the address on my mailbox," I replied. "Your father understood that. He worked hard to build something of value, but he never confused wealth with worth." "Dad's been gone for 3 years," Jackson said, an edge of frustration in his voice. "And with all due respect, he ran a modest technology company, not a global enterprise like Palmer Imports. Maybe if he'd had Howard Palmer's vision, his ambition, things would have been different for us." The comment hit me like a physical blow. Not just the dismissal of Howard's accomplishments, but the implication that our life together had somehow been less than it should have been. For a moment, I considered telling Jackson everything. About the sale of DataSphere, about the millions sitting in investment accounts, about the foundation helping hundreds of students afford college. But something held me back. If Jackson's respect for his father, for our family values, hinged on a dollar figure, then perhaps Howard had been right to be cautious about the effects of sudden wealth. "I think we should continue this conversation when we're both less tired," I said instead. "The wedding is just a week away. Let's focus on making it a joyful occasion." And after we hung up, I sat in the dark hotel room for a long time, contemplating my options. I could continue, as I had been watching silently, as Jackson was absorbed into the Palmers' world of wealth and status. I could reveal the truth about Howard's financial legacy and deal with the inevitable shift in how everyone, including Jackson, would see me. Or I could find a middle path, a way to assert my values without necessarily disclosing the full extent of our financial situation. As I finally drifted toward sleep, I made a decision. The Palmers had invited me to a family dinner at their home the night before the wedding, ostensibly a gesture of inclusion, though I suspected it was more about having everyone under their control. I would use that occasion to make my stand, to reclaim my place in my son's life, not as a peripheral figure to be managed, but as a parent whose values and wisdom deserved respect. What form that stand would take, I wasn't yet certain. But for the first time since this engagement began, I felt a sense of purpose and resolve, replacing the hurt and confusion that had dominated my experience. Howard, my Howard, had trusted my judgment about when and how to reveal our financial situation. The time was approaching when I would need to make that call, guided not by hurt pride or desire for validation, but by what would truly serve Jackson's best interests in the long run. The week before the wedding passed in a whirlwind of final preparations. I was included in some activities, a rehearsal at the venue, a meeting with the photographer to discuss family portraits, but excluded from others. The message was clear. I was necessary scenery for certain aspects of the wedding, but not an essential participant in the event itself. I maintained a polite, pleasant demeanor throughout, conserving my emotional energy for the moment that mattered. The family dinner at the Palmers' Lake Forest estate would be my opportunity to reset the dynamics that had developed during the engagement, not through confrontation, but through clarity and quiet strength. The evening arrived warm and clear, with a gentle breeze off the lake. I drove myself to the Palmers' estate, having declined Linda's offer to send a car for me. This small assertion of independence felt important, a precursor to the larger stand I planned to take. I had dressed carefully in a simple but elegant outfit, not the stylist selected clothes from Nordstrom, but a classic dress I'd owned for years, one that Howard had always particularly liked. Around my neck hung the pearl pendant he had given me for our 25th anniversary, not ostentatious by the Palmers' standards, but meaningful to me. The dinner would be small, just the Palmers, Jackson, Natalie, her older brother Ryan, who had flown in from London, where he worked in finance, and myself. As I was shown into the formal dining room by their housekeeper, I noted the elaborate table setting, the fresh flowers, the general aura of practiced luxury that characterized everything the Palmers did. "Elaine, welcome," Linda greeted me, air-kissing near my cheek. "We're just having drinks on the terrace before dinner. Come join us." I followed her through French doors to a stone terrace overlooking immaculately landscaped gardens that stretched down to the lakeshore. Howard Palmer was holding court, describing a recent business trip to Milan, while the others listened attentively. Jackson stood beside Natalie, his arm around her waist, nodding at appropriate intervals in Howard's story. "Ah, Elaine," Howard acknowledged my arrival with a nod. "What can I get you to drink? Wine? Something stronger." "White wine would be lovely, thank you," I replied. As Howard went to pour my drink, Linda steered me toward a seating area. "We were just discussing the honeymoon plans," she said. "Natalie and Jackson will be spending 2 weeks in the Maldives, staying at the most exclusive overwater villa resort. Howard arranged everything through his connections." "That sounds wonderful," I said, accepting the wine glass Howard handed me. "Jackson has always loved the ocean." "Has he?" Natalie looked surprised. He never mentioned that. We used to vacation at a little cottage on Lake Erie when he was growing up, I explained. He would spend hours in the water, fascinated by the fish and plants. At one point, he wanted to be a marine biologist. Lake Erie, Ryan raised an eyebrow. Bit of a step up to the Maldives, isn't it? The comment was clearly meant to highlight the contrast between Jackson's modest upbringing and the luxury Natalie's family could provide. I noticed Jackson looking uncomfortable, but saying nothing to defend our family vacations, which had been filled with love and simple pleasures, despite their lack of extravagance. Different experiences have different values, I replied evenly. Those vacations were rich in family connection, if not in cost. An awkward silence followed, broken by the housekeeper announcing that dinner was served. We moved back into the formal dining room, where I found myself seated between Ryan and Linda, directly across from Jackson and Natalie. The meal was exquisite. Multiple courses prepared by the Palmers' private chef, each accompanied by perfectly paired wines. The conversation flowed between topics familiar to the Palmers' circle: exclusive resorts, private clubs, mutual acquaintances in high society. I participated politely, but minimally, waiting for the right moment to shift the dynamic. It came during dessert, when Howard raised his glass in another toast to the couple. "To Natalie and Jackson," he said, "may your lives together be blessed with all the success and privilege you both deserve." Linda and I couldn't be prouder to welcome Jackson into our family. As glasses were raised, I spoke up. "I'd like to add something, if I may." All eyes turned to me, some with surprise, as if they'd forgotten I might have something meaningful to contribute. "Tomorrow my son marries the woman he loves," I began. "As his mother, nothing could make me happier than seeing him build a life with someone who cherishes him. But as we celebrate this union, I think it's important to acknowledge not just where Jackson is going, but where he comes from." I looked directly at my son, whose expression wavered between curiosity and apprehension. Jackson was raised with certain values that his father and I held dear. I continued. We believed that character matters more than possessions, that generosity should be practiced quietly, not for recognition, that true success is measured by the lives you touch, not the wealth you accumulate. I paused, noting the slight stiffening in Linda's posture, the narrowing of Howard's eyes. I've been quiet during much of this engagement, watching as Jackson has been encouraged to embrace a different set of values, a different measure of worth. I've heard suggestions that I should sell my home, change my appearance, essentially erase the life and legacy that Howard and I built together. "Elaine," Linda began, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of my comments. "I don't think anyone meant to suggest." I held up a hand gently. "Please let me finish. This isn't an accusation. It's simply an observation. And it leads me to something I've been considering for some time." I reached into my purse and withdrew a folded document, placing it on the table before me. 3 years ago, when Howard, my Howard, passed away, he left me a letter along with some surprising information. Information that changes how this conversation might proceed. Jackson was watching me intently now, confusion evident on his face. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "Your father sold Datasphere Technologies to Nexus Corporation 18 months before his death in a private transaction that was kept confidential even from you and me. The sale price was $75 million. The stunned silence that followed was exactly what I'd anticipated. Howard Palmer's wine glass paused midway to his lips. Linda's eyes widened dramatically. Natalie and Ryan exchanged glances of disbelief. But it was Jackson's face I watched most carefully, the shock, confusion, and dawning realization washing across his features. "That's not possible," he finally managed. "Dad's company was successful, but not that successful, and he would have told us. He wanted to protect us from the potential negative effects of sudden wealth," I explained, "to give himself time to plan how we would handle it without changing who we are fundamentally. His death came before he could share this with us." I opened the document, a recent statement from my primary investment account, and passed it to Jackson. After taxes and estate costs, Howard left approximately $68 million, which I've managed conservatively. The current value is just over $75 million. Jackson stared at the statement, his hands trembling slightly. "All this time," he whispered, "all this time you've been living exactly as I choose to live." I completed his thought. "In the home your father and I shared, with the possessions that hold meaning for me, pursuing the activities that bring me joy and purpose." I turned to the Palmers, who were watching this revelation with expressions ranging from shock to calculation. "I've established a foundation in Howard's name that works primarily in education, access, and medical research. We've distributed nearly $15 million in grants over the past 3 years, anonymously. Why keep this a secret?" Howard Palmer finally asked, his voice betraying both confusion and a new note of respect. "Especially during the engagement, you must have known how it would change perceptions." "That's precisely why," I replied simply. "I wanted to know who valued me, who valued our family, for who we are, not for what we have." I looked directly at Natalie, whose expression had transformed completely, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty and calculation. I wanted to know who would respect an apparently ordinary widow living a modest life, and who would see such a person as an embarrassment to be managed or marginalized. The implications of my words hung in the air. Linda looked deeply uncomfortable, while Howard seemed to be reassessing me entirely. Ryan was clearly calculating what this meant for his sister's future financial prospects. But it was Jackson's reaction that mattered most to me. My son looked stunned, overwhelmed, and, most painfully, ashamed. "Mom," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I had no idea. The things I said, the way I've been acting, you've been influenced by a powerful set of values that measures worth in dollars and status," I said gently. "It happens easily, especially when you're in love and want to be accepted by your partner's family." "I don't understand why you wouldn't tell me," Natalie interjected, an edge to her voice that suggested she felt tricked somehow. "All this time, letting us think you were just a widow of modest means," I finished for her. "Yes, and I learned a great deal from how I was treated under that assumption." Howard Palmer cleared his throat. "Well, Elaine, this certainly puts things in a different light. Had we known of your financial situation, we would naturally have approached certain matters differently." "Yes," I said quietly. "That's rather my point." Linda, ever the social manager, attempted to salvage the moment. "This calls for celebration. Howard, perhaps the special champagne we've been saving." "No, thank you," I said, rising from my chair. "I've said what I came to say, and now I think Jackson and Natalie might appreciate some time to process this information privately. The wedding is tomorrow after all." I looked at my son, who seemed rooted to his chair, still struggling to integrate this new reality. "Jackson, I'll see you tomorrow. I love you, and I want nothing more than your happiness, built on authentic values that will sustain you through life's challenges." With that, I left the dining room, nodding to the housekeeper, who appeared to show me out. Behind me, I could hear the conversation exploding into life. Linda's high-pitched questions, Howard's measured responses, Natalie's increasingly agitated tone. As I drove away from the Palmer's estate, I felt lighter than I had in months. I had no idea what the next day would bring, whether the wedding would proceed as planned, whether Jackson would be angry or grateful for my revelation, whether Natalie would see him differently now that she knew of his inheritance. But I had done what Howard, my Howard, would have wanted. I had protected our family's values while finally sharing the truth about our financial situation. Whatever happened next would unfold as it should, with all cards on the table and all masks removed. For the first time since this engagement began, I felt I had honored not just Howard's memory, but the life we had built together. A life rich in what truly mattered, regardless of bank balances or social status. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of the lake through my hotel room window. I had slept surprisingly well. The weight of secrecy finally lifted from my shoulders. Whatever happened today would happen in the light of truth, not in the shadow of false assumptions. I wasn't entirely sure the wedding would still take place. After my revelation at the family dinner, anything seemed possible. Perhaps Natalie would be angry about being deceived all these months. Perhaps Jackson would